Look at these books. They may seem similar, but each was written by one of two different authors. We usually think of books as stories, characters, or plots, but what if we think of them as data? Now suppose we represent each book using the same 50 common words and just count how often each one appears. Each book then becomes a point in a 50-dimensional space. So now we're no longer in 2 or 3 dimensions, which raises the obvious question: how do we see anything in 50 dimensions? 50 dimensions isn't something we can actually picture, so even if two authors write very differently, we can't really see how their books are positioned in this space. If we take one book from each author and only use the 2 common words the and, we get this scatter plot. Each point is a text block, and the axes show how often those 2 words appear. The black circles are Baum, and the empty circles are Thompson. But the points are mixed together, so we can't separate the 2 authors. 2 words simply aren't enough. So instead, we use the 50 most common function words. That gives us enough information to capture writing style more reliably. Each text block is then represented in a 50-dimensional space. We experience 3 dimensions. We don't experience 50, so we can't directly visualize a 50-dimensional space. But the question is, can we still get a glimpse of it, just enough to see how these books relate to each other? Most people know The Wizard of Oz and its adaptations, including the musical and film Wicked. But not everyone realizes that L. Frank Baum, the creator of the Oz books, wrote only 14 of them, while the official canon includes 33. Oz scholarship later made it clear that the 15th book was actually written by Ruth Plumly Thompson, even though Baum's name appeared on the cover. So now we have the same book associated with 2 different authors. I'm Jose B., the traveling medical data scientist. Today, I'm stepping away from medical data to revisit a question that began in childhood when I first read the Oz books. It's a question scholars discussed for decades following the publication of the 15th book in 1921. Can we approach it differently by taking a glimpse into 50 dimensions? I'm not a literary scholar, so I approach the problem the only way I know how, by treating the books as data, placing them in a 50-dimensional space, and comparing the distances between them. This approach dates back to Carl Pearson in 1901 and was later adapted to computational stylistics by John Burroughs in 1987. That brings me to my own work. I conducted an analysis that was published in Chance, a magazine of the American Statistical Association, where it was featured on the cover. It was also covered in Science News. While most people know Baum's The Wizard of Oz and its adaptations, including the film and musical Wicked, here I focus on a lesser-known question about authorship in the series. So here's the problem. How do we compress 50 dimensions into 1, 2, or 3 so we can actually see how these books relate to each other? Let me show you the timeline. After writing The Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum found it hard to leave that world behind, and over the next 2 decades he wrote 14 books. When Baum died in 1919, his publishers faced a problem. The Oz stories were too successful to end, but their creator was gone. So they brought in Ruth Plumly Thompson, an established children's writer, to continue the series. But when the 15th book was published, it still carried Baum's name. Thompson turned out to be just as prolific. From 1921 to 1939, readers got a new Oz book almost every Christmas. By 1939, she had written 19 books, bringing the total to 33. The 15th Oz book, The Royal Book of Oz, was published in 1921. Baum's name was on the cover, while Ruth Plumly Thompson was only credited as having enlarged and edited the work. In a letter after the title page, Maud Gage Baum explained that the book was based on unfinished notes left by her husband. But that explanation didn't settle the issue. 3 decades later, Oz historian Jack Snow argued that the book was actually written by Thompson. Today, most scholars agree with that view. And yet, the first edition with Baum's name on the cover is still being sold today on sites like Amazon. Literary scholars usually study writing style in a qualitative way. They read, interpret, and describe. But if we want to analyze style statistically, we need something we can actually measure. A natural way to do this is to count how often words appear. Broadly speaking, there are 2 types of words we could count. Here, we're going to focus on function words. Why focus on function words? Words like the, to, and of show up all the time, and we don't really think about how often we use them. They're also hard to replace because sentences wouldn't make sense without them. Content words are different. They depend on the topic and can be swapped out or manipulated. They also don't appear as often, so if we want to capture a writer's underlying style, function words give us a much more reliable signal. Now that we've decided to focus on function words, let's build the dataset. We start by identifying the 50 most common function words across the Oz books. There's one complication. Not all of Thompson's books were in the public domain at the time. So, out of the 33 Oz books, only 28 were included in the analysis. These are the 50 function words we're using to represent each book. Not surprisingly, the shows up the most, followed by words like and, to, and of. We use blocks of 5,000 words, so the word frequencies are stable, meaning they don't change much from one block to another just by chance. Our goal is to see whether these text blocks form two separate groups. To do that, we need to figure out where each block sits in 50-dimensional space. We do this by counting how often each of the 50 function words appears in every block. Those counts become the coordinates, so each text block becomes a point in 50 dimensions. Here are two text blocks. If we focus just on the 50 function words, where would these points fall in 50-dimensional space? Let's look at an example using Baum's final book. The left panel shows the first paragraph before we do anything to it. Now we keep only the 50 function words, so the text gets reduced to what you see on the right. Only about 38% of the original text remains. From there, we count how often each word appears, and the standardized counts become the coordinates in 50 dimensions. The next question is, since it's impossible to directly visualize hyperspace, is there a way to glimpse the relative positions of the text blocks in 50 dimensions? I will now show an animation demonstrating the method using just one axis. Later, I will extend it to two axes to prevent the text blocks from becoming too clustered in the visualization.
Let's visualize the methodology in 3D space, using the standardized scores of the three most frequently occurring words as the axes. To identify the first principal component, we seek the direction that captures the majority of the variance in the data. As the space rotates, we aim to minimize the sum of the squared perpendicular distances between each point and this new axis we call first principal component, or PC1. You can see the perpendicular distances between the points and the yellow axis decreasing as the rotation aligns the data to its optimal orientation, revealing the primary structure. Finally, the first principal component is established, successfully reducing our 3D complexity to just 1D while preserving the most important information.
You can think of the method as flattening 50 dimensions down to 1 while trying to preserve the overall structure. Here's what happens when the text blocks of Baum and Thompson are flattened onto the first principal component. To prevent overlap, I introduced a second dimension purely for display. In other words, the vertical axis in this figure has no meaning. The origin is marked as O. Notice that the method doesn't force the two authors to fall on opposite sides, but that's exactly what happens here. First, the separation is perfect. There's no overlap between the two authors, even though this first component only captures about 20% of the variation. Second, the split happens right at the origin, which is quite striking. The direction doesn't matter. We could flip the axis and nothing would change. But everything is squeezed onto one line, so it gets crowded. That's why we'll move to 2 dimensions next. Since everything gets crowded in 1 dimension, we can spread things out by moving to 2 dimensions. When we project the text blocks onto a plane instead of a line, the separation becomes clearer. The second component doesn't really help distinguish the two authors, but it does make the picture easier to read. Now let's see what happens if we add some of Baum's other books that aren't part of the official Oz series. Even though these books are not in the Oz canon, they still use characters connected to the world of Oz, and yet all of their text blocks still line up with Baum's cluster, not Thompson's. Now let's go a step further and look at 2 books that have little or no connection to Oz. Even then, their text blocks still line up with Baum's works, not Thompson's. Now let's look at short story collections from both authors. Here we see a slight overlap between the 2 groups. One reason is that short stories are much shorter, so I combine multiple stories into a single 5,000-word block. As a result, a block may mix different writing styles, which slightly blurs the separation. Even so, the overall pattern still holds, and most text blocks align with the correct author. Now, strictly speaking, we didn't need to test the method on non-Oz books, since the question is about the Royal Book of Oz. But seeing such a strong match between author and text gives us confidence that the method works. So now we're ready to answer the main question. So what about the 15th book, the Royal Book of Oz? When we look at the data, its text blocks clearly fall within Thompson's cluster, not Baum's. This matches what most scholars believe today, that the book was written by Thompson, not Baum. Because each book is represented by multiple text blocks, We can also see that this pattern is consistent throughout the book. And even though the 14th and 15th books were written around the same time, their styles are clearly different. But what if a book was written by neither Baum nor Thompson? Martin Gardner, a well-known popular math writer, wrote his own Oz book in 1998.
I loved Baum's Oz books as a child, and am proud to say that I wrote the first article that went into detail about Baum's colorful life. All my life, I have hesitated to write another Oz book. My respect for Baum's canon was so great that I felt it would be a kind of sacrilege to write one. Before the centennial anniversary of the publication of The Wizard of Oz, I finally persuaded myself that it would be impossible to damage the royal historian's reputation by writing a new Oz book. I have done my best to come close to Baum's simple style and to remain faithful to the whimsical land and characters he created.
So where does Gardner fall? Interestingly, despite trying to imitate Baum's style, the text blocks labeled G suggest his writing is closer to Thompson's. In panel A, we're looking at 5,000-word blocks. The first principal component continue to separate the main authors quite clearly. Baum's text blocks are on the right, Thompson's are on the left. Gardner's samples, marked with the letter G, fall within Thompson's region. But notice something interesting. Even though Gardner aligns with Thompson along this horizontal axis, his samples form a much tighter cluster. This suggests that while his writing is closer to Thompson's than to Baum's, it is also more internally consistent and may reflect additional stylistic features that aren't fully captured at this level of resolution. Now in panel B, we increase the block size to 10,000 words and the structure becomes much clearer. The separation between Baum and Thompson along the first principal component is more pronounced. With larger blocks, there's less noise, so their primary stylistic differences stand out more clearly. But the more interesting change involves Gardner. His samples no longer overlap with Thompson's cluster. Instead, they separate along the second principal component. So even though Gardner still falls on the Thompson side of the first component, the second component shows that his writing is systematically different from both authors. In other words, Gardner has his own distinct stylistic signature. What this tells us is that once we account for the main source of variation in the data, which separates Baum and Thompson, the next most important pattern is what distinguishes Gardner from the other two. And that's exactly what the second principal component is capturing here. Together, the first and second principal components explain about 27% of the variation in the data. Notably, when we use 10,000-word blocks in the earlier examples, nothing fundamentally changes. If anything, the separation between Baum and Thompson becomes even clearer. Here are the main takeaways. Writing style can actually be measured using the frequencies of common function words. Once we do that, each text becomes a point in a high-dimensional space. We then use principal component analysis, or PCA, to reduce those dimensions and make patterns visible. When we do this, the books of Baum and Thompson form clearly distinct clusters, and when we look at the Royal Book of Oz, it aligns with Thompson, not Baum. As we've seen, visualizing the data in 50 dimensions uncovers idiosyncratic patterns in writing style that might not be immediately obvious. This approach not only reveals these hidden unconscious patterns, but also has the potential to answer complex authorship questions when the conditions are right. As the title of this channel suggests, I am a traveling medical data scientist. Today, I'm sharing footage I captured in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. I woke up early on the weekend and went to the Recoleta area before the crowds arrived. There, you'll find Floralis Genérica, which translates to universal flower. This is a 23-meter steel sculpture that behaves like it's alive. It has 6 giant metal petals made of stainless steel and aluminum, designed to open in the morning and close at night, like a real flower. It stands about 23 meters tall, weighs 18 tons, and spans up to 32 meters when fully open. Its movement is controlled by hydraulics and light sensors. At night, when closed, it glows red from within. A major storm in 2023 damaged some of the petals. Still, Floralis Genérica remains one of the iconic landmarks of Buenos Aires. It was designed and donated by Argentine architect Eduardo Catalano in 2002 as a symbol of renewal since it reblooms each day. That's all for today's video. If you learned something new about projecting high-dimensional data or analyzing writing style using numbers, feel free to leave a comment below. If anything was unclear, I'd be interested to hear that as well. And yes, if you think this discussion has some relevance to the film and musical Wicked, Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. This is Jose B., the traveling medical data scientist, signing off.